I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much.
Tonight, WRHU commemorates the 20th anniversary of 9/11.
We're going to think positive because you got to help each other get off the floor.
We take a look at all viewpoints from what is widely considered the most egregious act of terrorism in United States history. From up in the sky,
I literally could see the skyline change as the planes were hitting. That is something that I'll always remember.
to inside the newsroom,
It certainly is the biggest story I ever covered in my whole career.
to those just feet away from the collapse,
That's when she began to see these people jumping out of the windows.
and even the fight for victims inside the courtroom.
The family members don't realize that they are now entitled to this compensation.
Join your anchors Crystal Bermudez and Bonsu, as well as the rest of the WRHU News team, as they take you through the emotion, sacrifice, and day that was 9/11. Only here on 88.7 FM, Radio Hofstra University.
And now, 9/11, 20 years later.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Bonsu.
And I'm Crystal Bermudez.
Tonight, we'll be taking a look at all aspects of the 9/11 attacks,
You'll hear from people who were there the day the plane struck the Twin Towers.
and from experts who break down the reverberations the attack had around the country and what comes next for the United States.
September 11th, 2001 is a day that will never be forgotten. It all started when American Airlines Flight 11 departed from Boston's Logan Airport at 7:59 a.m., bound for Los Angeles. The flight was hijacked 15 minutes later, and at 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. Around the same time, United Airlines Flight 175 was hijacked as well. The flight crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center at 9:03 a.m. and would collapse 56 minutes later. While chaos was unfolding in Manhattan over in the nation's capital, American Airlines Flight 77 was also hijacked and flown into the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. At 10:03 a.m., another hijacked flight, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed into a field in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Later reports confirmed that the passengers on board attempted to revolt against the hijackers after hearing about the other hijackings from their loved ones. Then at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed. In the 2.5 hours since Flight 11 left Boston, the Twin Towers lay in ruin, nearly 3,000 perished, and life as we knew it would be changed forever.
Tomorrow's the 20th anniversary of a day that changed the world forever. Shortly after the towers fell, everyone stood together as one nation, as America was trying to recover from this devastating day. 20 years later, we reflect on what took place and what has changed. The country has grown stronger. The establishment of the Department of Homeland Security was one of the major changes from that day, which has provided increased security and has made everyone have a sense of freedom and safety. The Patriot Act was also signed into law following the attacks, which seeks to crack down on acts of terrorism in the U.S. and around the world. However, we must still look back at those lives who were lost, from the people in the towers to the first responders.
Nassau County Executive Laura Kern unveiled the county's new 9/11 First Responders Monument yesterday at Eisenhower Park. Here's WRHU reporter Ryan Pagano with the report.
20 years ago, the devastating events of September 11th, 2001 forever changed the country. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives that day, with 348 of them being Nassau County residents. 20 years later, surviving family members gathered at Eisenhower Park for a ceremony to pay tribute to those whose lives were taken way too soon. The ceremony began with a reading of the names of those 348 Nassau County residents. Kathy Collins lost her sister in the North Tower that day and was among those who participated in the reading. She says the ceremony as a whole was beautiful.
I think it's very much needed, and it shows respect to all those that have perished.
Bridget Miller was among those who attended the ceremony as well, and she says she looks forward to attending the ceremonies every year.
It's always wonderful, and tonight was no different. It was very special, and I was very surprised, being that it's a rainy afternoon, that so many people showed up. And I look forward to this every year because we get to meet people that are on the same boat as we are, that lost family, and it's nice to see each other.
Following the reading of the names, Nassau County Executive Laura Curran unveiled a new responders memorial within Eisenhower Park's existing 9/11 memorial. Curran says the inspiration for the addition was because of the many first responders who passed away from illness in the years following the attacks.
Reading about and learning about and talking to the family members of people who lost first responder loved ones since 9/11. You know, we have a beautiful wall here with the names of those who died on 9/11, but there are still people dying because of 9/11. And we wanted to make sure that we were honoring and thanking them and giving their families a place to come and feel that they belong here as well.
The ceremony was a reminder to many that the countless acts of heroism shown that day will never be forgotten.
I'm very grateful to the family members that came and read the names. I know that that's not easy. I'm grateful to our team in Nassau County, whether they're first responders or whatever it is that they do to serve our residents here. And I'm glad that we were all able to come together to acknowledge, to commemorate, and to be together as a community on this terrible anniversary.
For WRHU News, I'm Ryan Pagano.
Thank you to Ryan for that report. After the tragic attacks on September 11th, many were shocked and confused as to what was going on. However, the news media kept people informed. In a rare occurrence, news stations came together uniting America in the wake of such a shocking and horrific event. On top of that, much of the media captured during and after the attacks were used to identify victims and conduct investigations into the perpetrators of said attacks, while also being used for historic record.
9/11 changed the way many people lived on a day-to-day basis, but it also changed the way breaking news was covered. My co-anchor Yao takes you inside the newsroom of some of the country's most prominent networks as the events of 9/11 unfolded.
We interrupt this broadcast.
We interrupt this broadcast.
We interrupt this broadcast.
Breaking news out of New York City.
We interrupt this broadcast. Breaking news. This just in. Words that have become synonymous with urgent news. However, on September 11th, 2001, those words took a new meaning.
The wife of a producer called me and said, "Hey, Morris, I don't know if you know this, but a plane hit the World Trade Center and it's on fire. I can see it from my apartment."
Marcy McGinnis is the former senior vice president of CBS News, and at the time of the 9/11 attacks, led the CBS newsroom.
But immediately my news instincts kicked in, and I called Dan Rather, who was our premier anchor at the time, and I said to him, "I don't know what this is, but you better get into the office as soon as you can, just in case it's, even bigger than what it already looks like it is," which was a pretty big accident.
These urgent phone calls and rush of emotions was when the first plane hit, but then moods in newsrooms across the country quickly shifted.
By the time the second plane hit the second tower, they knew that it was deliberate. And they also knew that by that time, these were not small planes. You have to remember that initial reports, and as many of them point out, initial reports are often wrong.
Joe Gardner is a New York Times best-selling author, and his book, We Interrupt This Broadcast, details notable events throughout American history. For his chapter on 9/11, Gardner spoke with reporters, anchors, and executives from multiple news outlets, including NBC, CNN, ABC, and more.
At that moment, all of the networks, CNN put a camera on the Statue of Liberty, ABC put a camera on the Sears Tower, because they had no idea what was coming next.
When the second plane hit, newsrooms were in a state of turmoil, but with CBS News headquarters being located in New York City, this story became more personal than most.
There was a young woman whose dad was in the World Trade Center, and he was on the 110th floor. She was a wreck. He was confined to a wheelchair because he had polio when he was a young boy. And she finally got him on the phone, and he said, "Don't worry, honey, the plane hit the other building." And so that's one of those moments where we were all there, and we watched that second plane hit that second building, knowing that this young girl's father was going to die because he was on the 110th floor.
Over at CNN, David Borman was an executive producer at the time of the attacks. That newsroom was facing its own internal battle. With Aaron Brown being the premier news anchor, Borman wanted Brown outside for live coverage. However, Executive Vice President Sid Bedingfield wanted Brown live in studio. And Bedingfield wasn't the only news executive that felt threatened by the idea of live outside coverage.
All admitted that they felt vulnerable because 30 Rock was a high-profile building and felt that they could be a target. So it's certainly understandable on Sid Bedingfield's part that CNN might be a target as well. But I think that David has such keen instincts that his decision to put Aaron out there on the balcony was wise.
The conflict at CNN was only one situation where leadership was tested, but for Marcy McGinnis, it was more so balancing the fine line between boss and friend.
Those are moments when as a leader in something like this, you have to literally be a comforter and a leader at the same time. And that just shows a lot of, I think, you don't become that kind of leader overnight. You build the trust with your staff day in and day out so that they trust you, so that they know that you're there for them.
That fine line was also being walked on by Beth O'Connell, who was a former executive producer for NBC News special events.
Beth O'Connell talked about, feeling this, this sense of responsibility to her team. There was nothing, no matter how experienced these broadcast journalists were at the time, nothing prepared them for 9/11.
While the goal was to get both truthful and effective coverage on the air, the emotions of the day often filled the room.
They would look across the newsroom and they would see one of their colleagues with their heads down on their desk, knowing that they had just gotten word that someone they knew or a loved one perished in the collapse of those towers. So it was an experience unlike anything they'd ever had before.
On a normal day, newsrooms are competing to see who could get the most eyes onto their broadcast. But when the events of 9/11 occurred, there's a feeling that no matter who you work for, journalists were all on the same team.
Any thought of competitive barriers just dissolved. I mean, they all shared pictures, they all shared information. At one point in the day, all of the heads of the news divisions of all of the networks were all on the phone together with the White House.
A picture tells 1,000 words, but the images of 9/11 for many executives just weren't digestible.
What pictures do we show? It's as one White House figure shared, these people are scared enough. We don't need to scare them anymore.
Mara Rubin was the former assistant news director and reporter for WRHU in New York. She was on site conducting a man-on-the-street interview when she witnessed arguably the most frightening image of the day.
The person that she was interviewing, just asking them about their experience, what have they seen, what are they feeling, all this, just typical man-on-the-street types of topics. That person that she was interviewing was facing north towards her. Mara was facing south and could see the Twin Towers over the subject's shoulder.
Reporters are often seen as Herculean in a way, with the job of informing the public no matter the circumstances. John Monotone is a former reporter for 1010 Winds in New York and was also on site covering the events of 9/11.
Talked about the experience of going down there to Ground Zero, not knowing, are there other bombs that are set to go off? Not knowing, are there other terrorists down there with automatic weapons? They just knew that it was, as he said, we just knew it was our job to be reporters and to go down there and to get the story and to report the story to the best of our ability.
Very quickly, the way in which reporters covered this story shifted. The immediate headline was that multiple planes were hijacked. However, the spotlight eventually got put on victims and their families. Mara Rubin is on record saying the day after 9/11 is worse than 9/11 itself. And that's primarily because what she witnessed when trying to get the hospital angle of 9/11. But what she saw was nothing.
They had operating rooms ready to go. They had, they were ready to receive people, but there was nobody coming. And instead, there were people there with pictures of their loved ones and pictures from their weddings, anything that they could have to identify their loved one, hoping that somebody had seen them or that they would be coming. And she wound up doing those kinds of stories, and it was very traumatic for her, as you can imagine. Just one sadness after another.
Reporters wanted to get the best stories possible, no matter the pain, but it was just as important to find and only tell what they know as fact.
What happens when something that big is unfolding is you have to be really, really conscious of what do you know and what do you not know, so that you can reassure the audience that you're there to give them information, to calm them down, to tell them what you know, to tell them what you don't know.
With tensions running high, the margin of error was large, resulting in numerous false reports.
They reported the fire on the mall in D.C., and actually that turned out to be smoke coming from the Pentagon. But the vantage point of the reporter, it appeared to be a fire there.
And as for the events of 9/11, many stories were told, but many victims still have yet to be identified. We interrupt this broadcast. Breaking news, this just in, have become synonymous with urgent news. And on 9/11, those words took a new meaning.
It takes a special kind of person. It takes special kind of dedication to want to do something like that. Put yourself in harm's way. It takes a special kind of person. It takes special kind of dedication to want to do something like that. Put yourself in harm's way for the sake of the greater good of society. And I'm proud to be part of that industry that does that.
For WRHU News, I'm Yao Bonsu. Next, WRHU News Director Kate O'Brien and Specialty Format Director Cassidy Slayman spoke with the Dean of the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication and former executive producer at NBC News, Mark Lukashevitz, about his experience covering 9/11 as it was happening and how the day's event shapes his perception of the role of news media.
We are here talking to Dean Mark Lukashevitz, who is the Dean of the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication here at Hofstra, to talk about his experience on 9/11 when he was a producer at NBC. So, Dean Luke, before we talk about what your experience was like on September 11th, can you talk about what your role was at the time at NBC and some of the projects that you were working on?
So at NBC at the time, I joined NBC in the summer of 2000, so I'd been there a little over a year after a long career at ABC News. And I was in charge of a new unit trying to combine special reports within MSNBC, CNBC, and NBC News at the time. The project I was working on at that moment was quite an exciting one. We were going to do a point of view documentary inside the White House, the Bush White House, the following week. The week after 9/11 it was scheduled to film. We would have 40-plus people inside the White House complex for 24 hours documenting a day in the life of the White House.
And now let's talk a bit about what happened on September 11th itself. What did you see that day? Walk me a little bit through what you saw, what you heard.
So I was driving into work. I was actually headed for MSNBC's headquarters. I live in Westchester County, north of the city. And I was headed to MSNBC's headquarters, which at the time were in New Jersey. So I was headed down towards the GW Bridge when on the radio I heard the first news of a plane hitting the World Trade Center. And I quickly realized that's likely to be a big news story today, so I rerouted myself and headed towards my office at 30 Rock. Coming down the West Side Highway, I came around a curve where I could see the tower on fire, and it was very clear this was a very major incident. By the time I got to my parking lot on, I think, 48th Street, the second plane had hit, so it was very clear now we weren't dealing with anything accidental. This was a deliberate attack. And people were already rushing to that parking lot trying to get their cars to get out, to go find loved ones. The sort of panic in the streets was already building, and I went into 30 Rock.
Can you walk us through what the next couple of days were like for you, breaking the coverage and working with the anchors and other producers that were there? How did you manage all of this information when times were so uncertain, and being able to compile this to inform millions of really scared Americans?
It was it was a very difficult time for everybody in the country, and certainly far more difficult for the families of those who were directly affected, who were in those buildings, who were at the Pentagon, who were on those planes. But for us, we all felt a responsibility to keep the country. For us, we all felt a responsibility to keep the country informed. This was really the very beginning of the internet era, so broadcast television, cable news was still the number one way for people to get their information. It will surprise people of your generation. Cell phone cameras weren't a thing then, so there was home video. It was mostly camcorders that tourists were carrying around, but people weren't able to capture images on their phones at the time, and the cell phone network went down pretty quickly. I went right up into 30 Rock, and very quickly we knew this was really an incredibly major story, and we couldn't predict where it would end. The Today Show was on the air at the time. Tom Brokaw joined Matt Lauer and Katie Couric at the Today Show anchor desk, which is on the ground floor level across the street from 30 Rock on 49th Street. I went up to the president of NBC News' office, sat on the floor there as we all tried to figure out what was going on. The building was evacuated in short order because there were reports and rumors flying that other buildings were going to be attacked. So there was an order to evacuate 30 Rock. The news people didn't evacuate. But, looking back on it, some of the kind of things that go through your head, we were very aware we were in a building that might be attacked. So some of the staff in that third floor office went around gathering up pillows from furniture all over the floor so that if we had to jump out the windows, because they were old windows at 30 Rock that still opened, we could jump down a few floors and try to pile those pillows on the roof below us and not get hurt jumping out. So that's the kind of things we were talking about. I still have the notes I scribbled that morning as we were trying to figure out which plane had gone where, what the flight number was, how many people were missing, what planes were still missing. Remember, we had the two planes hit the World Trade Center. Shortly thereafter, our Pentagon correspondent was on our air, Jim Miklashevsky from the Pentagon, when he heard an explosion while he was talking on the air. And he very calmly said, "I don't want to alarm everybody, but I did just hear quite a powerful explosion here at the Pentagon." Well, that was the plane hitting the side of the Pentagon while he was on our air. And then, of course, we had Shanksville. For hours and then for days, we were trying to figure out what had happened. It was pretty clear pretty quickly who was responsible, that Al-Qaeda was the entity that was responsible for this. But where the next attack would come and what it would mean was very much in doubt. So I was there from that morning, and then was there for the rest of the week, doing mostly the overnight broadcasts, because NBC News stayed on the air 24/7 for days and days. And we were doing overnight broadcasts for several weeks afterwards as the story evolved. The country really was looking to us to help understand what had happened, what was being done, how life would change. I'm sorry for rambling a bit here. The first few days were unsettling. One of the images that sticks with me from the first few days was the expectation. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, so I'll go back. On that morning, one of the things that strikes me the most was how, for many of us, our brains couldn't process what our eyes were seeing. When the first tower was hit and then the second tower was hit, we knew there was very serious damage. There was a lot of cloud and smoke pouring over lower Manhattan. When the first tower collapsed, what you saw on screen was sort of the tower sliding down and an enormous cloud of dust and debris. And I have to say, even as I watched that, what I was asking myself is, when is the dust going to clear so we can see which part of the building fell off? I'm waiting for the dust to clear from that column. And when the dust cleared and you realize the building wasn't there anymore, it was just incredibly difficult to process that. Like, it's not there. And now, of course, we immediately went to, that means the next one's coming down. And in the end, 3 buildings came down that day. So that was one thing that stuck with me. The other thing that went on for days that was really incredibly upsetting and sad was the posters that were posted all around Lower Manhattan as people looked for their relatives. St. Vincent's Hospital, which was close to the site of the World Trade Center, prepared a triage center out on the street. There were emergency workers with stretchers waiting on the sidewalk for the survivors, because we all thought there were going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of people pouring out of that area with injuries and burns. They didn't come. The truth was there were the walking wounded who got out, but when those buildings collapsed, those people disappeared. And so that moment, and then seeing those posters of people looking for their relatives, thousands of them, knowing that there were no people mysteriously in a hospital and identified somewhere, they were gone. And that was incredibly sad.
So you spoke a lot about the really troubling and gruesome things you ended up seeing. You're not only covering this, but you're living it, and your family knows you're living it. What was this like for both you and them? So I have 3 kids, and my youngest were just over 1 year old, 1.5 at the time, twins. And we live in Westchester, north of the city. My wife worked at ABC Disney. We talked, I think, once during that entire day. Then cell phone calls couldn't go through. She started to head home and managed to get home just barely before all the bridges into Manhattan were closed, because that was another thing that happened. Security was so intense. At one point, all of the bridges in and out of Manhattan Island were simply shut down. But I didn't get home for 3 or 4 days. I think I got home that Thursday night. I stayed in the city overnight, did overnight broadcasts. And, it was a very, very unsettling time. The other thing that I remember taking some hope from was on that Thursday when I wasn't home, and I missed it, but my daughter took her first steps. She'd been crawling. She was kind of a late walker, and she just got up and started walking. And it was kind of this moment where I thought, okay, down in Lower Manhattan, it looks like the world is ending. But for Julia, she's marching to the beat of her own drummer. It's time for her to walk. She's walking. Life goes on. And that was a very hopeful moment, but also sad because I wasn't there for it, but very hopeful.
And how do you think that 9/11 shaped how you perceive your career and the importance of being a news producer, and how do you think that this experience has carried you through your professional life for the last 20 years?
It was absolutely a defining moment, I think, for any journalists who were there, because we knew this was an event that was going to shape decades of world affairs, decades of American policy, the lives of our children and families. It did make me think about how important journalism was. And, it's if you go back to look at the news of that summer, and it's almost hard to imagine these days when there is story after story every day, there are important stories. But in the summer of 2000, I had this conversation with Peter Jennings, who I had worked with previously at ABC News. And we were talking about the fact that there was no news that summer. Every newscast was struggling to find a lead. And I had that conversation with Peter in August. And then I remember we both went back to work in September, and September 11th happened. And, that was the story for years. And it continues to this day. But I think it did cement for me the importance of journalism, and something I think we have to continue to focus on when the world looks like it's spinning out of control. the role of journalists in calmly presenting what's going on, separating fact from fiction, giving people a grounding in a shared sense of belief in facts, I think is really, really important. And it's becoming more difficult to do that with all the competing voices now that are not professional journalists. Mixed in on all the platforms that we all absorb our news from are propagandists, our interest groups, our radical, non-fact-based opinion leaders. And that makes it much tougher in a situation like a 9/11 to deliver that kind of dispassionate, factual reporting.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't asked you about?
No, I'm very happy that you're marking this anniversary. I think it's an important one. I think it's important for young journalists of your generation to look back at what journalism did in those days, and it certainly wasn't perfect. There were lots of rumors flying around. Journalists got things wrong. Some of the things that all of the journalists in the mainstream, or many journalists in the mainstream, got wrong led to policies like the invasion of Iraq that in hindsight, and even at the time, many people would have said were misguided policies. But I think it does underline the importance of factual reporting. That has to remain a mainstay of journalism. However journalism changes, your generation is changing journalism already. Opinion journalism, advocacy journalism, point of view journalism is more accepted now than it was 20 years ago. And that's fine. But a fidelity to facts and how important that is to keeping a democracy together, even in times of intense crisis, I think is very clear.
And if you're just tuning in, that was Dean Mark Lukashevitz of the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication at Hofstra University. Dean Luke, thank you so much for being able to talk with us and share your experience and your story.
Thank you.
Thank you to Kate and Cassidy for that interview. In the aftermath of 9/11, security in the United States changed rapidly. For many people, this change was visible in airports, where increased screenings made getting on a plane a bit harder. The changes also ran significantly deeper. To discuss these changes and the continued security threats from other countries, WRHU News Director Kate O'Brien spoke with Stanford security and terrorism expert Dr. Amy Ziegart. Here's a piece of their conversation.
For 88.7 FM WRHU, I'm Kate O'Brien, joined tonight with Dr. Amy Ziegart. Dr. Ziegart is the Morris Arnold and Nona Jean Cox Senior Fellow at Stanford University and specializes in topics including cybersecurity, international and national security, and terrorism. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you.
We're approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and that I know prompted a bunch of security changes. How much did general security really change after the 9/11 attacks?
I think especially if we're thinking about homeland security and intelligence, it changed dramatically, right? So 9/11 prompted the largest restructuring of American intelligence agencies in more than half a century. So before 9/11, you could just walk through airport security and not have to really do much or take off your shoes. That's totally different. Before 9/11, we had 12 agencies in the federal government collecting and analyzing intelligence. Now we have 18. Before 9/11, we didn't have someone in charge really overall outside of the CIA of our intelligence establishment. Now we have the Director of National Intelligence. So, and now we've also seen this tight integration of intelligence and military operations, which we've been seeing even most recently as 2 weeks ago in Afghanistan with the drone strike on what was believed to be an imminent suicide attack. So it's night and day different today than it was on September 10th.
Technology is so much more advanced than it was in 2001 and a lot more widespread. Does this make it a lot easier or harder for an attack, either one like we saw on 9/11 or a cyber attack, to happen?
Well, I think emerging technologies are creating a dramatically more complex and difficult threat landscape. So if you think about the global threat landscape, what did that look like? Well, in the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union was threat number 1, 2, and 3, right? It was very clear we had a principal adversary. After 9/11, it was really the war on terrorism was the primary concern. But now with cyberspace, all sorts of attackers can reach us without firing a shot from the comfort of their own laptop. And that includes powerful countries like Russia and China, weak countries like North Korea, and non-state actors and groups like ransomware groups. So it is a completely different, and I would say more challenging threat landscape today than it was even a few years ago.
And you mentioned to sort of counteract that new threat landscape, there's 18 offices that handle this security. And the U.S. ended up passing the Patriot Act after 9/11. How do you think the U.S. can balance privacy with national security in 2021 and going forward?
So I think, there are a bunch of different approaches to that question, right? So if we think about who's responsible for defending us in cyberspace, it's hard to answer that question. So when someone steals something from your house, you call the police. When there's a physical attack, we bring out the military. But if you're the CEO of a company and you've been hacked, who do you call? Do you call the FBI? Do you call local law enforcement? Who's going to respond for you? Who's going to defend you? So 85% of our critical infrastructure, so power, water, election systems, are owned and operated by the private sector. And to a great extent, they're on their own, right? So we don't even have mandates for basic cyber hygiene for a lot of these companies. So this is a very challenging world of where security doesn't rest in the hands of the government anymore. And then to get to your question about privacy and security, that's got more complicated too, right? Because Facebook and Google know a lot more about me than the National Security Agency does. They traffic in my data in ways that I don't know and cannot control. So how do we think about privacy in a world of algorithms where private sector actors can bundle your data and monetize it and sell it? And where's the balance for them, right? When we think about companies like Facebook have the power of governments, right? There are more Facebook users around the world than citizens of any country. So, and these are complicated areas to work through. And I think these companies are trying, but they are not accountable to Congress. They're not accountable to voters. They're accountable to shareholders that are global. So that too is sort of a new part of the terrain for national security, is how do we work with these companies that are vectors and victims in cyberspace?
Thank you, Kate, for that report. To combat the growing terror threat in the weeks, months, and now years after 9/11, the United States went to war. The attacks on 9/11 were determined to be the work of the terrorist group Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden. At the time, the Taliban had a strong foothold in Afghanistan, where bin Laden was determined to be hiding. When the Taliban did not give up his location, the U.S. Congress authorized a use of force to hold those responsible for the attacks accountable. The ensuing war on terror has had a death toll of over 6,000 Americans. Though the war in Afghanistan officially ended in August, military families were forever changed by the events of 9/11.
To get an idea of what military families and spouses have experienced in the last 20 years, WRHU's Kate O'Brien spoke with 2020-2021 AFI Air Force Spouse of the Year, Bree Carroll. Let's take a listen.
Especially now, especially as we're coming up on that anniversary of 9/11. Like I said, there will be a roller coaster of emotions that go on within the community that are felt across our nation, really. For those who do remember and for those who will kind of be reminded of that history.
As men and women went to war following the September 11th attacks, the number of military families in the United States grew. I spoke to 2020-2021 Armed Forces Insurance Air Force Spouse of the Year, Bree Carroll, about the impact the terror attacks and the return to war had on spouses and families. Not a lot of Americans know what it is like to have a loved one serve their country in the military.
Typically, they say about 1% of our population in America are those who serve in our armed forces. Well, about 50% of that population are even married. So that's an even smaller percentage that serve alongside their member as spouses or military spouses.
When the 9/11 attacks occurred, Carol was in middle school.
Growing up in New Jersey, I literally could see the skyline change as the planes were hitting. That is something that I'll always remember. And now I feel like I have this full circle moment as I will actually be in DC during the 20th anniversary, now with a different level of understanding, a different level of pride, if you will, that comes with the remembrance of the sacrifice of our first responders and our military members.
Now she is able to see the way the attacks and ensuing war affected the service community, both back then and now.
It really sparked and inspired a lot of people to want to serve. They wanted to defend the country. So there are a lot of people who are at this 20-year mark. They maybe started 20 years ago and they may be at the end of their service career and getting ready to retire. And then you have other sets who were inspired by the work that was being done in that region who came along a little bit afterwards. But I think it really shifted how just our fellow Americans just kind of looked at serving and that sacrifice, and they had more of a yes and a support. And the military community is just hugely grateful for the support that just the average civilian has given.
As an Air Force spouse, Carol is involved in the military community and is passionate about building up its strength. She used the coronavirus pandemic as an example to explain what it is like to be a military spouse or child.
This kind of feels like our element. Like, we are used to uncertainty, not as much as the health tolls and those type of impacts, but it is definitely something that I feel like can be very trying at times. Everybody's situation is very different, but it is one that is very rewarding at the same time. We get to, like we say, serve in our own right alongside our service member as they sacrifice so much for the country.
As the U.S. has now officially left Afghanistan, she says support is still important today.
Even now, even seeing these images coming out of Afghanistan with the roller coaster of emotion that we've all kind of been feeling, especially those who are close to me. I know I have friends who have lost their spouses to things that have happened in that region of the world. And it's very difficult to see what's going on now. However, I will say that the silver lining, if you will, is we still get those moments of pride where we see, particularly for Air Force, our airmen going over and beyond to getting people out, knowing that service and what they did was not in vain. And then even more so to see the American population really rally around our service community and say thank you and just support us. And that has been amazing to see. And I'm so grateful for that, even as we come up on this 20th anniversary of 9/11.
Reporting for WRHU, I'm Kate O'Brien.
Thank you again to Kate for that story. The physical impact from 9/11 remains to this day for thousands of New Yorkers. In the months following the attacks, dust and debris remained in Lower Manhattan, exposing up to 500,000 people to toxic chemicals and dust. WRHU producer Cassidy Slammin spoke with Michael Barash, an attorney who has represented more than 25,000 victims and families. Barash and his firm has also advocated for the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund, which has committed to financially supporting anyone with a 9/11 related illness. Let's take a listen.
I spoke with Manhattan-based attorney Michael Barash, a personal injury lawyer who has represented more than 20,000 victims and families who have developed 9/11-related illnesses. First, I wanted to hear more about what Mr. Barash saw and experienced on September 11th, 2001.
Well, my office is just 2.5 blocks from the World Trade Center, and I was here that day. I didn't see the first plane hit, but I heard it. The building shook. I actually saw the second plane hit. And then I went running up to my office where I was kind of like a deer in headlights. I mean, I just could not believe what I was seeing. I couldn't grasp what I was seeing, and especially the people jumping out of the windows. It was horrifying. And why are they jumping? Why don't they just run down the stairs? I didn't realize the planes had completely taken out the stairwells and the elevators. And then, I watched, and then finally when the first tower started to implode, that's when I turned to the 3 people I was with in the office at the time. I said, holy cow, we better get out of here. So we went running down the stairs, and by the time I reached 18 floors down, my office lobby was already filled with smoke. So I understand what it was to be exposed to the toxic dust. And I went running uptown while all those heroes were, with their sirens blazing, were coming downtown. Now fast forward, 5 days later, Christine Todd Whitman of the EPA assured us all the air is safe to breathe. Why? They wanted to reopen Wall Street. I get it. They were afraid what's going to happen to our economy if they don't open the stock market the next Monday. So they did. And so many New Yorkers returned to their lower Manhattan offices and their homes and their schools. And, my office was closed for about a month because we had no electricity. But when we did return in mid-October, the buildings were still on fire. They were on fire for 99 days, Cassidy. And every time you walked out of the subway to walk to your office, every time you went out to grab lunch, if you opened your windows, if your air conditioning was on, sucking in the air, and the wind was blowing in your direction, the smell was something I will never forget. And it was that way, at least for 99 days while the fires were brewing. But then thereafter, they didn't finish the cleanup until May 30th, 2002. So that was my exposure. On 9/11, I had 15 people working at my law firm. Half of them have developed cancer. I am a prostate cancer survivor. And a number of other people in the office have respiratory illnesses, all linked to the World Trade Center toxins. And I'm just one little office. I'm sure it's no different for the other 300,000 office workers, the other 25,000 downtown residents, and the 50,000 students and teachers.
And what does your practice do to advocate for survivors like yourself and to be able to represent thousands of New Yorkers who experienced 9/11 like you did?
Well, the first thing I'm trying to do is spread the word that the World Trade Center Health Program and the Victim Compensation Fund aren't just for first responders. They're not. They're for the civilians also. But while 80% of the first responders have enrolled in the health program, which is nationwide, by the way, less than 10% of the civilians have enrolled. And the main reason when I ask people why is they say, well, first of all, I didn't know about it. Or if they have heard about it, they thought it was only for firefighters and cops. Or then maybe they thought they didn't want to take money away from firefighters and cops. What they don't realize is that the government has permanently extended these programs till 2090, and they're fully funded. So you're not taking money away from firefighters and cops, who, by the way, they deserve every nickel they get. Because, God, as I said, I was running away and they were running towards the fires. But so many people have lost loved ones, Cassidy, since 9/11, because they've now linked 68 cancers to the toxins. And the family members don't realize that they are now entitled to this compensation, which could really make the difference for financial security for thousands of people. They should know about this. They should register. And if they know anyone living outside the New York area who was exposed, I urge them, please reach out. Make sure these people have signed up for the health program if they're still alive. And as I said, this health program is available in all 50 states. And if they're certified with a 9/11 illness, or they died of a 9/11 cancer or pulmonary condition, the family's entitled to compensation. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, which really can be significant for their financial security.
Is there anything that our listeners should know about your firm or your advocacy work or just about the resources that are available for 9/11 survivors?
First of all, 9/11 did not end on 9/11. People continue to get sick. I get asked these questions all the time. People are still getting sick? Yes, they are. All the time. Not a day goes by, Cassidy, without one of my clients dying of his 9/11 illness. It's truly heartbreaking. But what is even sadder is when people don't access what they are entitled to. So I so appreciate you following this story and helping to spread the news, mostly to non-responders, that they too are eligible. More people have now died of 9/11 illnesses than the 2,950 people who died on 9/11. And it's only going to get bigger and bigger as time goes on. So thank you so much for helping us spread the word about these two programs.
Thank you to Michael Barash and the Barash and McGarry Law Firm for their time and expertise. Reporting for WRHU News, I'm Cassidy Slamman.
Thank you so much to Cassidy for that interview. Here at Hofstra, the attacks and aftermath of 9/11 had a strong impact. 26 alumni and one student passed in the attacks. Every year, the university honors all of those who died that day at the school's own 9/11 memorial. WRHU's Adina Dawson attended today's memorial.
So many people across the United States have strong recollections of the moment two planes hit the World Trade Center. Hofstra University President Susan Poser also had a personal connection to the 9/11 attacks.
I was at my office in the law school at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, Nebraska, where we stopped classes and as a community watched and consoled each other as the horror unfolded on the television. I spent time that morning frantically trying to learn if my father had taken his usual route to work from Manhattan to Brooklyn on a subway that passes under the towers. Fortunately, he hadn't, much by chance. And chance was what determined what happened to so many people that day, whether they lived or whether they died.
Director of Orientation of Students Stanley Cherian was the new hire when the attacks happened.
I started at Hofstra about exactly 20 years ago, maybe about 2 weeks before September 11th. So I was brand new here at Hofstra when I witnessed what happened, in Pennsylvania, in New York, and at the Pentagon, and so it has stuck with me since it was sort of like a poignant moment when I first started.
Freshman student Jennifer Cheda came to today's ceremony in humble remembrance of the Hofstra community.
I was in Guyana at the time. I wasn't here, and family members, they were working in the city, and I remember a few of them, they were working at the 9/11 memorial, but they were happily able to be saved.
Mary Gale, senior assistant to the Office of Student Leadership and Engagement, recounted how her spouse, a first responder, was called to the site.
My husband was a detective sergeant in the city, and that morning, thank God, he was home. So, but when I saw the plane hit, I woke him up, and he was picked up within a half hour, and he had to be rushed into the city because he was emergency personnel, and I didn't see him for days and days.
During the September 11th Remembrance Ceremony, Hofstra alumni Paul Flora recited the names of the members of the Hofstra community that were lost.
Joni Sesta, Susan
As the ceremony came to a close, members of the Hofstra community presented roses and placed them in a wreath to signify the lives lost during the attacks. For WRHU 88.7 FM, I'm Athena Dawson.
Many thanks to Athena for that report. Here at WRHU, our community volunteers have their own stories. Host of Classic Showcase, Tony DeMauro, shares his experience the morning of 9/11 as he went for a job interview.
Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001, I was taking the Long Island Railroad into Manhattan for a job interview. I got to Penn Station about 8:40, a few minutes before the first plane hit the World Trade Center, and I went to a diner to get breakfast, and I remember my mother called me on my cell phone telling me that she just heard on the news that a small plane, she described it, crashed into the World Trade Center and for me to be careful. I didn't think anything of it, and then I finished my breakfast and I went outside to proceed to my interview, and that was about 9:15. The second plane had already hit the second tower. I remember seeing pandemonium on the streets of New York.
All of Manhattan was covered in smoke.
It was a stampede. At that time, it was about 9:30. I could smell the jet fuel in the air, and it was a disgusting stench. I can't even describe it. It was so terrible smelling. And then I can see smoke from 34th Street and 7th Avenue all the way downtown to Lower Manhattan. Black, billowing smoke. And I had to stand outside Penn Station until they opened it up, probably around 2:15 in the afternoon, and it was a very, very hot Tuesday. and I was dressed in a suit and tie, and I was just drenched.
DeMauro recounts his ride home.
It was a stampede to get down to the tracks. The train ride was about an hour and 10 minutes. It was going very, very slow, and it only made 2 stops from Penn Station, Jamaica and Hicksville, the last stop. And I just remember standing like a sardine on the train, and people just not saying a word and just basically being in silent prayer and just looking out at the city. It was undoubtedly the worst experience of my life.
Although 9/11 was a tragedy, DeMauro says it brought New Yorkers closer together.
Never forget the unity that the people in New York showed to one another, the help that it was offered by everybody, and the spirit of camaraderie that the city displayed that day, and just the love.
Thank you again to Tony for sharing his story. Many thanks to the entire WRHU News team. Our engineer this evening is Justine Brackenridge.
Thank you for tuning in, only here on your 3-time Marconi Award-winning radio station, 88.7 FM, Radio Hofstra University.
For WRHU, I'm Crystal Bermudez.
And I'm Yao Bonsu.
Thanks for listening and have a good night.